The deceptive summit captain Sarah Mitchell stood at the viewport of her transport ship, watching the massive space station grow larger as they approached. Concordia Station hung in the void like a gleaming city of metal and glass, its rotating sections catching the light of distant stars. Today, this neutral ground would either mark the end of a 5-year war or become humanity's greatest disaster. The war with the Kroleks. Empire had been brutal and one-sided. Their ships were faster, their weapons more advanced, and their numbers seemed endless. Human colonies on the outer rim had fallen one by one, forcing millions to flee toward Earth and the core worlds. The lucky ones made it to safety. The unlucky ones became statistics in a war that humanity seemed destined to lose. Sarah adjusted her blue naval uniform and checked her reflection in the viewport. At 35, she had already seen more combat than most officers twice her age. The scar running along her left temple was a reminder of the Battle of Proxima Station, where she had held off a Krolek's assault long enough for civilian transports to escape. Today, she carried a different kind of responsibility. As humanity's military representative, she would help decide whether her species would survive or perish. Behind her, 3 other humans prepared for what might be their final mission. Marcus Chun, her tactical advisor, studied intelligence reports on his tablet, his weathered face showing the strain of too many sleepless nights analyzing enemy movements. Elena Rodriguez, the chief diplomat, practiced her speech in multiple languages, trying to perfect phrases that might save billions of lives. Tom Bradley, the engineer, tinkered with a small device, his fingers moving with the precision that had made him legendary among the human fleet's technical crew. The docking clamps engaged with a metallic thud that echoed through the ship's hull. Sarah took a deep breath and led her team through the airlock and into Concordia Station. The main corridor stretched out before them like a canyon of polished metal, filled with beings from across the galaxy. Some walked on 2 legs like humans, others floated in environmental suits, and a few moved on mechanical appendages that clicked against the deck plates. The Kroleks delegation was already waiting in the main conference chamber. Admiral Vises, their military commander, stood nearly 8 feet tall, his reptilian scales shifting between green and gold as the light struck them. His forearms moved in complex patterns as he spoke with his subordinates, a gesture that Sarah knew meant either excitement or aggression in Krolek's culture. Beside him sat Counselor Vex, a smaller being whose black eyes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Their diplomatic corps had a reputation for turning words into weapons more dangerous than any plasma cannon. The conference chamber itself was a marvel of engineering, with a circular table large enough to seat representatives from 50 different species. Holographic displays showed maps of disputed territories, trade routes, and battle zones where human and Krolek's forces had clashed over the past 5 years. The ceiling was transparent aluminum, offering a view of the stars that both species had fought to claim. Sarah took her assigned seat across from Admiral Vises, noting how the Kroleks had positioned themselves with their backs to the chambers. Main entrance. In their culture, this was either a sign of complete trust or supreme confidence. Given their recent string of victories, she suspected the latter. Elena sat to her right, already activating translation devices that would convert the complex negotiations into languages both sides could understand. Marcus positioned himself where he could observe the entire chamber, his hand resting casually near the communication device on his belt. The opening ceremonies began with traditional greetings from various species that had volunteered to mediate. A peace talks. The Alterian ambassador, a being of pure energy contained within a crystalline form, spoke about the need for understanding between different forms of life. The Vorthan delegate, resembling a massive tree with eyes embedded in its bark, offered wisdom about the cycles of growth and destruction that governed all civilizations. But Sarah barely heard their words. Her attention was focused on the details that others might miss. The Kralex guards stationed around the chamber had moved closer to the human delegation since the ceremonies began. Their weapons, supposedly deactivated for the peace talks, showed small indicator lights that suggested they were actually armed and ready. Most disturbing of all, she noticed that Admiral Vyses kept checking a device embedded in his wrist scales, as if waiting for a signal. Marcus leaned closer and whispered, "Captain, the energy readings from this station don't match the specifications we were given. There are power signatures that suggest hidden systems throughout the structure." His voice was barely audible, but Sarah caught every word. If the station itself was compromised, then humanity's entire leadership could be walking into a trap. Bradley had been unusually quiet during the journey to Concordia, spending most of his time working on modifications to standard equipment. Now, as he sat at the conference table, Sarah noticed that he had positioned several ordinary-looking devices around his workspace. To anyone watching, they appeared to be simple translation aids and data recorders. But Sarah knew Tom's work well enough to recognize, when he was preparing for something other than diplomacy, the formal peace proposal was presented on holographic displays that filled the air above the conference table. The terms seemed reasonable. At first glance, both sides would withdraw from disputed territories, establish trade agreements, and share certain technologies for mutual benefit. The Kralex offered to provide advanced medical technology that could save millions of human lives, while humanity would contribute their expertise in planetary engineering and resource extraction. Elena read through the treaty documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that a single misplaced word could doom an entire species. But as she progressed through the technical clauses and legal frameworks, her expression grew increasingly troubled. She made notes on her tablet, highlighting sections that seemed unnecessarily complex or strangely worded. The afternoon session focused on implementation details, with both sides discussing how the peace treaty would be enforced and monitored. The Kralex proposed a system of joint patrols and shared monitoring stations, which sounded cooperative until Elena realized that most of these installations would be located near major human population centers. When she questioned this arrangement, Counselor Vex explained it as a necessary security measure to ensure compliance with the agreement. During a break in the proceedings, Sarah gathered her team in a small conference room that had been designated for the human delegation. The chamber was supposed to be secure, but Tom immediately activated a device that would scramble any listening equipment. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice grim. "Something about this entire situation feels wrong." Marcus pulled up a star map on his tablet, showing the current positions of known Kralex fleets. According to our intelligence, they should have withdrawn their main battle groups to their home systems as a gesture of good faith. But sensor readings from our deep space monitoring stations suggest that major fleet elements are still positioned near human space. In fact, some readings indicate they might be closer than ever before. Elena spread the peace treaty documents across the table, pointing to specific clauses that had caught her attention. "The legal framework of this agreement is designed to fail," she said. "There are provisions that would allow the Kralex to claim humans had violated the treaty for almost any reason, and the enforcement mechanisms would give them legal authority to take military action against our worlds." Tom looked up from the device he had been adjusting. "I've been monitoring the station's internal systems, and there's something you both need to know. The power distribution doesn't match a civilian installation. There are weapon systems built into this station's superstructure, and they're all oriented to fire inward toward the conference areas. If someone wanted to eliminate everyone gathered here, they could do it with the push of a button." Sarah felt her blood run cold as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The Kralex hadn't requested peace talks because they were tired of war. They had lured humanity's entire leadership to a neutral station where they could be eliminated in a single strike. While the human government died in space, Krolek's fleets would attack Earth and the remaining colonies, leaving humanity leaderless and defenseless. Asterisk. They're going to sign the treaty, Sarah realized, and then use it as justification for whatever they do next. When we're all dead, they can claim that humans violated the agreement and they had no choice but to retaliate. The audacity of the plan was breathtaking in its scope. The Kroleks weren't just planning to win the war. They were arranging to make their victory appear legal and justified to the entire galaxy. Marcus was already working on his communicator, sending coded messages to human forces scattered throughout known space. If we're right about this, then, we need to warn Earth and the colonies. But more than that, we need to make sure that when they spring their trap, we're ready to spring one of our own. Sarah smiled grimly as she thought about the preparations that humanity had been making over the past several months. The Kroleks weren't the only ones who could plan an ambush. Humanity had learned long ago that when someone offers you something that seems too good to be true, you should always be ready for the catch. And humans had become very good at being ready for anything. The afternoon session resumed with discussions about the actual signing ceremony, which was scheduled for the following day. Representatives from across the galaxy would witness the historic moment when two warring species chose peace over destruction. The ceremony would be broadcast to billions of beings, making it the perfect stage for whatever the Kroleks had planned. But as Admiral Vises outlined the details of tomorrow's events, Sarah noticed that his wrist device was blinking more frequently. Whatever signal he was waiting for, it was getting closer. She caught Tom's eye and gave him a slight nod. He responded by making an almost imperceptible adjustment to one of his devices. If their suspicions were correct, humanity would be ready. The day ended with formal dinners and cultural exchanges, giving representatives from both sides a chance to interact in a less formal setting. Sarah found herself in conversation with several Kroleks officers, noting how they seemed unusually confident for beings who were supposedly agreeing to end a war they had been winning. Their body language suggested anticipation rather than resignation, as if they were looking forward to something that would happen soon. As night fell over Concordia Station, Sarah stood once again at a viewport, watching the stars turn slowly as the station rotated. Tomorrow would bring either peace or the greatest battle humanity had ever fought. But unlike the Kroleks, she wasn't waiting passively for events to unfold. Across the galaxy, human ships that appeared to be simple cargo vessels and mining platforms were receiving coded transmissions and preparing to reveal their true nature. The trap was set, but the question remained, who was really the prey? When humans fight back, the signing ceremony began at dawn, station time, with representatives from dozens of species gathering in the main assembly hall. The chamber had been transformed overnight into a grand theater with floating cameras that would broadcast the event across the galaxy. Banners from every major civilization hung from the walls, creating a tapestry of colors and symbols that represented the hope of lasting peace. Sarah Mitchell walked into the hall wearing her dress uniform, complete with all the medals she had earned during 5 years of desperate warfare. But beneath the ceremonial fabric, she wore lightweight body armor and carried weapons that Tom Bradley had specially designed to function in the unique environment of Concordia Station. Elena Rodriguez followed close behind, carrying the ornate case that contained humanity's copy of the peace treaty. Admiral Vises was already at the ceremonial table, his golden scales polished to a mirror shine. The formal robes of his office were magnificent, embedded with precious stones that caught the light and threw rainbow patterns across the chamber walls. But Sarah's trained eye noticed that his four hands never strayed far from the ceremonial weapons that Krolek's tradition required him to carry. Weapons that were supposed to be purely decorative, The ceremony began with speeches from neutral species, who praised both sides for choosing diplomacy over destruction. The Alterian energy being spoke about the cycles of conflict that had plagued the galaxy for millennia, while the Vorthan tree creature offered wisdom about the patience required to grow lasting peace. Their words were beautiful and sincere, but Sarah barely heard them. Her attention was focused on the small device that Marcus Chon wore on his uniform collar, disguised as a simple communication badge. The device was currently dark, but when it flashed red 3 times, it would mean that human forces throughout the galaxy had detected Krolek's fleet movements. That would be the signal that the ambush was beginning, and that humanity needed to implement its own carefully planned response. Sarah found herself checking the device every few seconds, waiting for the moment when everything would change. Elena stepped forward when called upon to present humanity's commitment to peace. Her speech was carefully crafted to appeal to species across the galaxy, emphasizing humanity's desire to contribute to galactic civilization rather than simply survive. Within it, she spoke about the scientific discoveries that humans could share, the artistic traditions they could contribute, and the exploration missions they could undertake in cooperation with other species. But even as Elena spoke about humanity's peaceful intentions, Sarah was thinking about the hidden modifications that had been made to seemingly civilian ships throughout human space. Over the past year, cargo vessels had been equipped with military-grade weapon systems disguised as mining equipment. Passenger liners carried trained soldiers instead of tourists. Even the food transport ships that supplied human colonies were actually mobile weapons platforms ready to defend the worlds they served. Admiral Vises rose to give the Krolek's response to humanity's peace offering. His voice was deep and resonant, carrying easily throughout the chamber as he spoke about the end of hostilities and the beginning of a new era of cooperation. But Sarah noticed that his eyes never met those of any human in the room. Instead, he kept glancing at the chronometer displays around the chamber, as if timing his speech to coincide with some other event. The formal signing was scheduled to take place at exactly noon, station time. As the hour approached, Sarah felt tension building like electricity in the air. The Krolek's delegation seemed unusually alert, their body language suggesting anticipation rather than the solemnity appropriate for a peace ceremony. Several of their guards had moved into positions that would give them clear lines of fire toward the human delegation. Despite the supposedly neutral nature of the event, at 11:58 station time, Marcus Chun's communication device flashed red once, then twice, then 3 times in rapid succession. Sarah felt her heart rate spike as the signal confirmed what she had feared. Krolek's fleets were moving into attack positions around every major human world. The trap was springing exactly as they had predicted, but humanity was ready. Sarah's hand moved to her uniform collar, where she activated a transmitter that sent a coded signal throughout Concordia Station. Tom Bradley, who had been sitting quietly at the technical station, suddenly became very busy with his equipment. Devices that had appeared to be simple recording equipment began to emit high-pitched whines as they activated systems that had been hidden within their innocent-looking casings. Asterisk. At exactly noon, as Admiral Vises reached for his ceremonial pen to sign the peace treaty, alarms began sounding throughout the station. The Krolek's commander's wrist device flashed green, indicating that his fleets were in position around human worlds. He smiled coldly and gave a hand signal to his guards, who immediately drew their weapons and aimed them at the human delegation. "I regret to inform you," Vises announced to the shocked assembly, "that humanity has violated the terms of this treaty before it could even be signed. Our monitoring systems have detected aggressive military movements throughout human space. As provided for in the legal framework of our agreement, the Krolek's Empire must now take defensive action to protect our citizens." The lie was expertly crafted and delivered with perfect timing. To observers throughout the galaxy, it would appear That humans had betrayed the peace process, and that Krolek's retaliation was both legal and justified. The plan would have been flawless, except for one critical factor that the Kroleks had failed to consider. Humans were very good at learning from their mistakes, and they had been making contingency plans for exactly this scenario. Tom Bradley activated the device he had been working on throughout the negotiations, sending a massive electromagnetic pulse throughout Concordia Station. Every electronic system in the chamber shut down instantly, including the Krolek's weapons and communication equipment. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as the station's primary power grid automatically rerouted around the damaged systems. In the darkness, human soldiers who had been disguised as maintenance workers and technical staff throughout the station suddenly appeared from service corridors and ventilation shafts. They carried weapons that were specifically designed to function in electromagnetic pulse environments, and they moved with the precision of troops who had drilled for this exact situation hundreds of times. But the real surprise was happening throughout human space, where the Krolek's perfect ambush was meeting a response that would reshape their understanding of human nature. The cargo ship Determination, which had been peacefully hauling mineral ore between Mars and the asteroid belt, suddenly revealed its true nature as its hull plates slid aside to expose massive railgun batteries. Captain Lisa Park had been waiting for this moment for 8 months, and her crew was ready. The Krolek's battle cruiser Dominant Strike had been hiding behind a cloaking field near Earth, waiting for the signal to begin bombardment of humanity's home world. When Admiral Vyses transmitted his attack order, the massive ship dropped its cloak and powered up weapons that could reduce cities to glass. But as targeting systems locked onto major population centers, something impossible happened. The entire planet disappeared behind a shimmering barrier of energy. Humanity had spent 2 years building planetary defense shields while publicly negotiating for peace. Every major world in human space was now protected by technology that could absorb and redirect the massive energies that space weapons could deliver. The Kroleks had planned to destroy human civilization in a single coordinated strike, but instead they found themselves firing at targets that simply absorbed their attacks and converted the energy into power for even stronger defenses. Back on Concordia Station, Sarah Mitchell fought her way through corridors filled with smoke and emergency lighting, leading her team toward the station's communication center. If they could get a message to the galaxy explaining what had really happened, they might be able to prevent the Kroleks from claiming that humans had started this final phase of the war. Elena Rodriguez was proving that diplomats could be warriors when necessary, using her knowledge of alien psychology to predict how Krolek soldiers would react in different situations. Her ability to think like the enemy made her incredibly effective in the close-quarters combat that filled the station's narrow passages. Marcus Chun coordinated the human response with the tactical precision that had made him legendary among the fleet's strategic planners. The battle for Concordia Station became a microcosm of the larger conflict raging throughout the galaxy. In every engagement, human forces were outnumbered and outgunned, but they fought with a desperate creativity that their enemies couldn't match. They used the station's own systems against its occupiers, turning maintenance robots into improvised weapons and redirecting life support systems to create tactical advantages. The turning point came when Tom Bradley managed to access the station's main computer core and upload a virus that he had been developing for months. The program was specifically designed to target Krolek's command and control systems using their own communication networks to spread chaos throughout their fleet coordination protocols. Within minutes, Krolek ships that had been operating in perfect formation began receiving contradictory orders and firing on each other. Throughout human space, the pattern repeated as seemingly helpless civilian vessels revealed themselves to be warships in disguise. The Kroleks had expected to face scattered resistance from demoralized survivors. Instead, They found themselves fighting an entire species that had spent months preparing for this exact betrayal. Every human world, every space station, every seemingly innocent transport ship had become part of a vast military machine that activated at precisely the moment when it would do the most damage to Krolek's forces. The psychological impact on Krolek's commanders was devastating. They had built their entire strategy around the assumption that humans were weak and would surrender when faced with overwhelming force. But now they were discovering that humanity's greatest strength wasn't their technology or their numbers. It was their absolute refusal to give up, even when defeat seemed certain. Admiral Dizes himself discovered this when Sarah Mitchell kicked down the door of his command center on Concordia Station. The Krolek's commander had expected to be broadcasting humanity's surrender to the galaxy by now. Instead, he found himself facing a human warrior whose species had just turned his perfect ambush into his greatest defeat. "You made one mistake," Sarah told him as human soldiers secured the command center. "You assumed that because we wanted peace, we weren't prepared for war. But humans learned a long time ago that if you want peace, you need to be ready to fight for it." The final phase of the battle lasted only 3 hours, but in that time, the balance of power in the galaxy shifted permanently. The Krolek's empire, which had seemed invincible just days before, found itself facing total military collapse as their ambush fleets were systematically destroyed by human forces that seemed to appear from nowhere. Ships that should have been carrying grain were launching missiles. Space stations that should have been processing ore were deploying defense systems that made them harder to destroy than military fortresses. When the shooting finally stopped, the galaxy had learned something important about humanity. The species that had seemed weak and desperate was actually one of the most dangerous opponents any civilization could face. Not because they were naturally violent, but because they were naturally stubborn. They simply refused to accept defeat, no matter how hopeless their situation appeared. The peace treaty was eventually signed, but under very different circumstances than anyone had originally planned. This time, the Kroleks were the ones requesting mercy, and humanity was the species deciding whether their former enemies deserved to survive. The galaxy watched in fascination as humans chose forgiveness over revenge, helping to rebuild the very civilization that had tried to destroy them. But the lesson was clear. Underestimating human determination was a mistake that no species would make twice. In a galaxy full of powerful civilizations and advanced technologies, humanity had found their niche as the species that simply would not quit. And that, more than any weapon or technology, made them a force that could reshape the stars themselves. Chat controls Sonnet 4.